You're about to discover a war that was never officially declared, but that was fought frame by frame for almost 50 years in movie theaters in Moscow, in low-budget studios in Hollywood, and in the mind of a Russian director who despised Stanley Kubrick with everything he had. When you think of 20th century science fiction, you probably picture silver spaceships, talking robots, and the United States as the country that invented the genre exactly the way you know it. But you're about to learn something very few film fans know, which is that the Soviet Union fought its own space race on movie screens, years before NASA even existed, and won several battles of that war without Hollywood ever fully admitting it. It was 1924, the Soviet Union was barely 7 years old, the economy was devastated after the Civil War, and in the middle of all that chaos, a studio called Metropolis decided to invest in what was, in all likelihood, the first great science fiction blockbuster in the history of cinema. It was called Aelita, directed by Yakov Protazanov and based on a novel by Alexei Tolstoy, and it told the story of a Moscow engineer who, obsessed with a mysterious radio signal, builds a spaceship and travels to Mars, where he falls in love with the planet's queen, Aelita, and ends up unintentionally leading a workers' revolution among the Martian population. The plot, seen through modern eyes, feels almost naive, but what was truly revolutionary about Aelita wasn't the script, it was the look of the thing. The Martian costume and set design was handled by Alexandra Exter, one of the most important artists of Russian constructivism, an avant-garde movement that rejected traditional decorative art in favor of geometric, angular, almost mechanical shapes, and that up until that point had barely left the art galleries to reach a mass audience. In Aelita, that visual language made it onto the big screen for the very first time, with transparent plexiglass costumes, triangular headpieces, and sets that looked like they'd been pulled straight out of a Cubist painting, long before anyone in Hollywood had even considered what an extraterrestrial should look like. And that aesthetic didn't stay within Soviet borders, because 3 years later, in 1927, Fritz Lang released Metropolis in Germany, and several film historians have pointed to clear parallels between Lang's urban, mechanical imagery and what had already appeared in Aelita, though, as tends to happen with this kind of influence, there was never any explicit acknowledgement from German cinema, or later from American cinema, where echoes of that same geometric aesthetic would resurface in productions like the early Flash Gordon serials of the late 1930s. Aelita was also a pioneer in something we'd today call viral marketing without a second thought, because its Moscow premiere was accompanied by a publicity campaign in which posters and flyers with cryptic messages signed by Aelita herself were circulated around the city, as if the Martian Queen were sending real communications to the population, generating the kind of anticipation we'd instantly recognize in any modern release campaign. So while science fiction cinema didn't even exist as a recognizable genre yet in Hollywood, Moscow was already filming a blockbuster with its own aesthetic, real visual ambition, and a hype campaign worthy of a modern release. Interestingly, inside the Soviet Union itself, the film didn't have much of a commercial run, partly because the cultural authorities of the time felt its fantastical tone strayed too far from the realism expected of Soviet cinema, and incomplete prints circulated for decades until, well into the 20th century, a version more faithful to the original cut could finally be reconstructed. That was the true origin of everything that follows. Let's jump forward more than 3 decades to the episode that best sums up this whole silent war because it's without question the most brazen of them all. In 1959, the Soviet studio Dovzhenko released a film titled Nebo Zovyot, which roughly translates to The Sky Calls, directed by Mikhail Karyukov and Alexander Kozier. The plot, for its time, was fairly sophisticated. 2 spaceships, 1 Soviet and 1 American, secretly race to be the first to reach Mars, and when the American ship suffers a serious malfunction, it's the Soviets who divert their own mission to rescue the rival crew, sacrificing their own shot at getting there first. It's basically a fable about the moral superiority of collectivism over individualism, told with spaceship models that were surprisingly elaborate for the budget the studio was working with in those years. 3 years later, in 1962, Roger Corman bought the US distribution rights. And this is where the story gets really interesting because he didn't stop at dubbing it into English. Corman handed the job to a film student fresh out of college, a 20-something kid named Francis Ford Coppola. Yes, the same one who would direct The Godfather a few years later, and who at the time credited himself as Thomas Kolchart because, as he'd later admit himself, he was a little embarrassed to have his real name attached to a project like this one. Coppola shot new footage, re-edited a good chunk of the Soviet material, and released it under the title Battle Beyond the Sun. But the most significant change wasn't visual, it was narrative, and here's the detail that's really worth remembering. According to the Aurum Encyclopedia of Science Fiction Cinema, in the original Soviet version, the space race is won by the eastern side. While in Corman's American cut, the ending was completely reversed so that the West would come out on top instead. In other words, the propaganda wasn't written into the original script, it was literally rewritten on the editing table of a low-budget studio in Los Angeles, changing the outcome of someone else's film so it said exactly the opposite of what its Soviet director had intended to say. Corman, on top of that, kept reusing pieces of this same film in later cuts, blending its footage with other Soviet productions he'd picked up for next to nothing, in what would become a perfectly refined working method. And as we're about to see, this wasn't an isolated case, it was only the first in a series of nearly identical operations. If Battle Beyond the Sun was the dress rehearsal, Planet of Storms was the masterpiece that Corman decided to carve up not once, but 3 separate times. Directed in 1962 by Pavel Klushantsev, a Soviet filmmaker who would go on to earn a reputation as an absolute pioneer of special effects, the film follows an expedition to Venus that runs into dinosaurs, hostile plant life, and a volcanic eruption, complete with a robot that, in a detail that's genuinely surprising for a Soviet production of that era, even plays music you can dance to along the way. What matters here isn't so much the plot as the technique, because Klushantsev's visual effects were, by 1962, several years ahead of what Hollywood was doing at that exact same moment, and that's not a personal opinion. It's something Western filmmakers who studied his work closely in the decades that followed openly acknowledged. Klushantsev had spent since 1957 perfecting a front projection technique that let him combine live actors with planetary backdrops in a way that, at the time, no one else could match. And that same technique is the one Kubrick's own visual effects team would later study closely when working out some of the most memorable space sequences in 2001, even though Klushantsev's name never once appeared in that film's closing credits. In other words, even the project we consider the technical peak of Western science fiction cinema drew, indirectly and without official credit, on work a Soviet filmmaker had been developing in Leningrad nearly a decade earlier. Roger Corman, always on the lookout for a bargain, bought the rights in 1965 and hired Curtis Harrington to turn the material into a new film, Voyage to the Prehistoric Planet, adding scenes shot with 2 recognizable American names, Basil Rathbone, who had played Sherlock Holmes in classic cinema, and Faith Domergue. The result was sold straight to television. But Corman wasn't satisfied with getting just one film out of that material, so 3 years later, in 1968, he carved up the same Soviet footage a second time, this time adding new scenes with women dressed in prehistoric-style furs, and handed it to another young director just starting out, Peter Bogdanovich, who credited himself as Derek Thomas and who, only a few years later, would direct The Last Picture Show, one of the most respected films of 1970s American cinema. This second version was titled Voyage to the Planet of Prehistoric Women, and on some American television broadcasts it circulated under the even more colorful name Gill Women of Venus. So, a single Soviet film from 1962 ended up turned into 3 separate American products released between 1965 and 1968, directed by 2 future major names in Hollywood, without audiences watching them in theaters or on television having the faintest idea that what they were seeing, for an overwhelming percentage of the runtime, was footage shot years earlier in a Soviet studio. Ironically enough, given everything we've just covered, these same films would go on to find a second life decades later when the television show Mystery Science Theater 3000 dug up Voyage to the Prehistoric Planet to openly mock its seams, without the show or probably most of its audience being fully aware that they were unknowingly poking fun at the original work of a Soviet filmmaker whose name no one on screen ever mentioned. The third victim of this recycling operation was Mekhdin Navstrechu, Released in 1963 and also directed by Mikhail Kuryukov, the same filmmaker who had made Nebozoviat 4 years earlier. This time the premise leans closer to a romantic fable than a pure space adventure. The inhabitants of a distant planet pick up a love song broadcast from Earth over the radio, become fascinated by it, and decide to send an expedition to find its source, in a journey that gets complicated when the alien spacecraft is forced into an emergency landing on one of Mars's moons, forcing Earth to organize a rescue mission of its own. Within the Soviet science fiction output of that era, it's one of the least known films outside Russia, and in fact, it never even received its own commercial title in English-speaking markets beyond a literal translation, something that says a lot on its own about how invisible this part of film history became for Western audiences, showing up today in catalogs and technical listings simply under its transliterated Russian title, paired with the English translation, "The Galaxy Applauds You." Corman, sticking to his by then perfectly polished method, reused fragments of this material, mixed once again with scraps of Nebozoviat to keep feeding his own American cuts in a kind of recycling within recycling, where the same shot of a spacecraft launching could end up appearing, slightly trimmed and with a different color tint, in 2 or 3 different films sold as completely independent products. What's striking about this case, and it's worth underlining, is that neither Kuryukov nor Klushantsev ever received compensation anywhere close to what Corman took in from these repeated resales, because rights deals struck in the middle of the Cold War operated in a legal gray zone so murky that, in practice, they functioned more like paperwork-backed plundering than any kind of balanced business negotiation between two industries. And it's worth remembering that this was a business model with almost perfect economics for a low-budget producer like Corman, because the single most expensive part of any science fiction production, the special effects, already came fully solved thanks to Soviet labor, leaving only a handful of shooting days with second-tier American actors, a dubbing job, and a minimal release campaign aimed at the drive-in circuit, where this type of film found its natural audience without anyone bothering too much to check exactly where all that space footage had actually come from. Up to this point, the relationship between Soviet cinema and Hollywood had basically been that of a hunter and its prey, with the West walking away with the material and the artistic credit both. But starting in 1972, that dynamic completely reverses direction. And for the first time, it's the Soviet Union responding directly to something it saw on an American screen. In 1968, Stanley Kubrick had released 2001, A Space Odyssey, a film that, thanks in part to the visual effects Klushantsev had spent a decade perfecting, redefined what audiences expected from a science fiction production, with a cold, almost clinical tone, where technology and artificial intelligence carried as much or more emotional weight than the human characters themselves. Andrei Tarkovsky, who by then was already one of the most respected figures in Soviet cinema thanks to films like Ivan's Childhood, watched 2001 and came away deeply unsatisfied, not because he thought it was a bad film, but because, as he himself put it in various interviews, he found it a cold, almost dehumanized work, more interested in the machinery and the technology than in the soul of the people operating it. It's worth placing this in its broader historical context too, because we're talking about two countries that, in barely 15 years, had gone from launching the first artificial satellite in history, Sputnik, in 1957 to putting the first human being in orbit, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, in 1961, and were now openly competing to be the first to reach the moon. So when Tarkovsky decides to answer Kubrick, he's not doing it in a vacuum, he's doing it in the middle of the very same space race his own countrymen had been living out in reality for over a decade. His cinematic response was Solaris, released in 1972, based on the novel of the same name by Polish writer Stanisław Lem, and very deliberately conceived as a kind of direct emotional counterattack to Kubrick. The story follows a psychologist who travels to a space station orbiting an alien ocean capable of materializing the deepest memories and traumas of anyone who observes it, including, in the protagonist's case, the physical return of his wife, who had died years earlier. Where 2001 raised questions about the evolution of the species and the role of technology, Solaris raised them about guilt, memory, and grief, shifting the genre's center of gravity from the machine to human consciousness. And here's the interesting part, the detail that rarely gets told in this context, Kubrick. far from feeling attacked by this philosophical counterpunch, apparently genuinely liked Tarkovsky's film. According to several sources documenting the critical reception of the era within the international festival circuit itself, including Cannes, where Solaris won the Grand Prix of the jury, officially and publicly placing Soviet science fiction on the same artistic level as its American counterpart, something that up until that point had seemed almost unthinkable outside the borders of the Eastern Bloc. Seven years later, in 1979, Tarkovsky would return to science fiction with Stalker, a film that, in a sense, closes the loop on this entire story, because it no longer engages directly with Hollywood or with Kubrick, but deliberately moves away from any recognizable space or technological reference point. The plot, loosely based on the novel by the Strugatsky brothers, follows a guide known simply as the Stalker, who leads two men, a writer and a scientist, into the Zone, a forbidden and mysterious territory where, according to legend, there exists a room capable of granting the deepest wish of anyone who manages to reach it. There are no spaceships, no spectacular special effects in the Klushantsev style. No robots, no orbital station models, just abandoned industrial landscapes, stagnant water, and a constant philosophical tension that turns the character's physical journey into an almost spiritual one. In many ways, it's the complete opposite of what Hollywood understood science fiction to be in those same years, when in 1977 George Lucas, who according to several sources specializing in the genre's history was well aware of Klushantsev's pioneering work and its technical influence on an entire generation of filmmakers, had just released Star Wars and was about to change the commercial model of science fiction cinema forever, steering it toward adventure, mass spectacle, and character-driven merchandising. While Hollywood raced faster and faster toward mass entertainment, Tarkovsky moved in the exact opposite direction, and that final divergence is, perhaps, the best way to understand why this war was never officially declared, yet was fought all the same for decades, with each side defending a completely different idea of what the future was supposed to look like on a movie screen. The shoot for Stalker itself, by the way, wasn't an easy process either. It dragged on for more than 3 years, forced the crew to reshoot almost the entire film more than once due to technical problems with the film stock. And over time, various film historians have pointed out that the conditions of the location where it was shot, near an industrial site in Estonia, may have taken a toll on the health of several people who worked on the project in the years following its release, a detail that, for those familiar with the film, tends to add an extra layer of emotional weight to a work that already revolves entirely around a contaminated, forbidden territory. So the next time someone claims modern science fiction was born in Hollywood, it's worth reminding them of this whole story, the story of a Soviet film from 1924 that got years ahead of the visual aesthetic later credited to European and American cinema, the story of a producer who literally rewrote the ending of someone else's film so the wrong side would win, the story of two young directors, Coppola and Bogdanovich, who both started their careers recycling Russian footage without almost anyone in the audience knowing it, and the story of a filmmaker, Tarkovsky, who instead of trying to compete on Kubrick's own turf, chose to invent one entirely his own. It's a nearly 50-year story in which one side kept inventing the future of film with almost no international recognition, while the other, more than once, simply took it, trimmed it down, and sold it as if it had been theirs all along. If any of these facts surprised you, let us know in the comments which one you found the most unbelievable, and if you think there's another Soviet film from this era that deserves its own video on Todo Cine, drop it in the comments below, since a lot of this channel's best ideas have come straight from your own suggestions.